To take a line from a Monty Python movie, now it's time for something totally different. I will summarize just very briefly my lifetime in HCI, 40 years in one slide. For those of you who are younger and you want to know what it looks like, my background has been a mix of work in education, leadership and management, business, inventing many patterns and methods, and you can read all about this, so I'm not going to talk about it today. And, as Hiroshi said, I'm not dead yet. There's a lot of stuff left to do. What I would characterize as the thing that I am happiest about when I look back in my 40 years is doing things that were the first. In, as Gloria mentioned, the first handbook of human-computer interaction, bringing rapid prototyping to the masses as a methodology when everybody thought this was crazy and the world was full of waterfall software methods, bringing branding into the UX world as a business element, the first handbook in human-computer handbook of human factors applied to consumer products with Bill Cushman. All the previous books, for those of you who aren't old enough to remember, were for military applications and management, etc. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this photo here. This is from an Interactions article written by John Reinfrank in 1997 about the work we were doing at Oracle in one of the first commercial consumer user interface labs. And I'm not over. As I said, I have a book coming out in 2020 called UX Magic, which is actually an interaction design textbook because I couldn't find one that was suitable for my classes. Today I'm going to talk about one of my legacy topics, because I'm not in business and I don't deal with CEOs very often anymore, but has resulted in the Business of UX Forum in Interactions magazine. And I won't tell you too much about it other than it's been going on for quite a while. And this magazine is very important. And I'd like to invite anyone, particularly who's working in the commercial and industry world, to consider contributing an article. When you talk about the business of UX, I create this sort of tag cloud, and the two items that stand out the most are strategy and management, because that's what I'm going to talk about today. If I was going to talk about other things, they would be highlighted. I'm going to try and summarize in less than 30 minutes two Interactions articles. The Business of UX Strategy, which came out last year, and Bill, if you'll hold up the magazine, they're standing next to you, just wave one in the air. Last week, cover issue, Business of UX Management. So these are companion articles, and you can get the magazine. There's a few here. There's some in the exhibit area, and I believe by registration. If you don't read Interactions magazine, you should. Now, what is it when we really get into this management and strategy? Well, there's this kind of loop where you're dealing with business goals and organizational culture, and I'm going to share just a little bit of my thinking on these two different topics. The main thing I want to point out, assuming you can see a cursor, is the word value. So while you go and try and invent the future and you see the kind of inspirational work that Hiroshi showed, when you are a corporate officer, your job is to generate value immediately for users and for shareholders. These are not the same thing. When you look at the meaning of value in the business world, and this is one of the hardest things for UX professionals to understand, is in the business world, the word value is quantitative, and it refers to exchange value. If I add this feature, if I spend another $1 million developing this product, how much more money do we make for the shareholders? Now, as designers, we hate this world because we talk about user value, which is a bit more qualitative in nature. And we live with that tension. So if you look at the world of UX strategy and running large corporate UX teams, which I did for about 20 years for Oracle and UX and some other companies, UX strategy is doing the right thing. And it's a difficult topic, and it matters a lot because most products fail. UX strategy is poorly understood, and as I mentioned, there's this tension between design and business because our understanding and our desire for value are simply not the same, even though the word is the same. Now, coming from California and living in wine country, I have to use wine as a metaphor for everything. But strategy is kind of like making a good wine. If you don't pick the right location for the vineyard and you don't plant the right grapes, and then you don't execute in the construction of your wine, you get very bad results. You have to do everything. But we have a saying in California, and also in the tech industry, which is, you cannot make good wine from bad grapes. You can make bad wine from good grapes. It's perfectly possible to screw up. That's why I'm going to talk about management as well. UX strategy is not all the things that you see on the internet and the conference series on UX strategy. I find are insufficient because it's not about the tools and templates and technologies and things like that, and it's not how you run your department. That isn't strategy. Those are all tactics. Strategy has to be optimized to generate value. And in this case, I'm going to talk more about the business value. And what you really have to understand in the strategy world is there's two concepts. Obviously, you have your business goals and you have your distribution. You shouldn't build a product you don't know how to sell, right? That's a good way to get your UX team laid off. Now, what really you have to understand is two concepts. One is called megatrends and the other is called constraints. And I'm going to touch on these just in summary. You can go back and read the full articles. But you don't get to control these. God doesn't control these. I don't know who controls these things. But as the designer, the design executive, the chief design officer, you need to learn to ride these waves. Megatrends is a word introduced by John Nesbitt in 1982. And he coined it as the context for policy decisions in society and business. And obviously wrote the book, Megatrends, which is a good one for everybody to read. Today, there's a lot of megatrends if you're trying to design a product, and I'm going to show you a case study of a very impressive product that I had a tiny bit to do with. But consumerization of IT, multi-platform, SaaS, Internet of Things, AI, the quantified self, the sharing economy, the gig economy, these are all these trends that are happening. And if you're trying to put a product into the market, you need to understand them and you need to ride them. I'm only going to talk about two. The article talks about a few more. When you look at each of these megatrends, there are a bunch of drivers and there's a bunch of results. Now, the interesting thing for the consumerization of IT is that digital natives are now in management positions. Used to be, we talk about digital natives entering the management workforce. But now that they're actually in management positions, they're making purchasing decisions. And that changes everything. And it's led, for example, to the venture capital community in Silicon Valley having design partners. They have to ensure that the UX is going to work for whatever the market they're going to, and they will not invest without adequate oversight of your UX. Another one is multi-platform delivery and kind of the Internet of Things. To me, they're somewhat combined. And the quantified self movement. Now, this has caused a lot of results in terms of interoperability standards and consistency challenges. But when you think multi-platform, you might be thinking about your phone or your wearable or your laptop. I'm going to point to these two devices down here, which are probably less familiar to you guys, because to me, multi-platform includes the human body. So in this sense, I'm not quite that far apart from what Hiroshi showed you. The bottom left item is a blood glucose sensor that goes in your body from Dexcom. The one on the other side here is a contact lens that Microsoft research started and now Google has taken over, which is a contact lens with a transmitter in it that does your blood glucose reading based on your tears, so the moisture in your eye. So we'll come back to those Internet of Technology, Internet of Things. Constraints. Constraints fall into this Venn diagram, and I'm only going to touch upon, at this point in the talk, the upper one, which is market and business constraints. And there's two kinds, universal and market specific. So again, from a strategy standpoint, one example of the universal constraint is what is the reference product you're competing with? And I'm certainly not going to read you this whole table. I just want to talk about the first line, for example. there's no cost to Google, no offense to my colleagues from Google, for Google to be wrong in a search. It sets an expectation that search results are instantaneous. I do most of my consulting work in medical products and mostly in cancer recently. And to do a clinical trial search has about 20 to 22,000 parameters. And if you're wrong, the patient can die. It's very expensive. And people say, well, get a faster computer. And the only computer that this runs on is IBM Watson. So we're not short of resources when you go to clinicaltrials.gov. So you have this issue about an expectation being set, and you have a critical UI decision, if I can get a cursor here, which I can't, the upper right corner, performance versus accuracy. This is a trade-off in user expectations that have to be managed, and it's not the same as the consumer feeling, yet all the doctors, of course, that we work with in these cancer products do have this expectation that search is instantaneous. So you have to know when to innovate, when to copy, and when to ignore. And that's one example. The second example is who makes the purchase decision. And it's very different based on the business model if you're in direct sales or if you put your product in the App Store and consumer reviews are more important than professional reviews. So there's all of these other constraints that occur simply based on how you're going to sell your product. Now I'm going to show you a case study just to show you how far you can go with this. This is a product under development called Bigfoot Biomedical. It's an artificial pancreas. So to your left is an insulin pump with no controls, that it gets wired into your body. The middle is the blood glucose sensor, and then the app is run by an iPhone. Three-way Bluetooth, no controls on the insulin pump other than the phone. Obviously, the goal here is to be completely wired if you're a type 1 diabetic and keep your blood glucose range safe. And just looking at this from a business model perspective, the megatrends involved in building a product like this include, obviously, the Internet of Things, all these sensors. It's multi-platform. The human body is part of the platform because these things are going inside you. You have AI driving the algorithms to determine what to do with the insulin dosing. The reading frequency is every 5 minutes. And you can imagine all kinds of things happening because if you're at high altitude, less insulin. If you're at high altitude and you're going very, very fast, downhill. Easy to tell from the phone, right? What are you doing? You're skiing. Drop the insulin level. This person is in a probably heavy exercise. Big data for all the doctors. This product is not on the market yet, but it's been through the first set of FDA trials. I joke with the CEO that it's going to be delivered by a drone from Amazon. It comes with no training. A typical insulin pump comes with 4 to 6 hours of training at the cost of $400 to $600. But literally, it will arrive at your door, and you will do the body hack, and it will be pre-programmed. It has a very unusual business model. It's shared cost with the insurance companies. So if the insurance companies don't make money, this company goes out of business. It's got all these constraints, including the FDA. So you kind of get an idea here that in just one product, you could hit every one of these mega trends, all these different constraints, and if you're wrong on any one of these, not only does your UX strategy fail, the company goes under. And this is not a small garage startup, because to do a medical product, you actually need some pretty heavy funding, even if you're a startup. So the key insights that you can take away from part one of my talk are really that all of these constraints and megatrends are of equal importance to actually understanding users and how they're going to do them, or you're not going to generate any value. And the tension, as I noted, between the design definition of value and the business definition are always going to be in conflict with each other. So now I'm going to flip to the other side of the coin, and I want to come over and talk about this latest article, it came out last week, on UX management. So management is doing it the right way when strategy is doing the right thing. Again, if you don't get the whole loop, you don't have a whole protein, right? The patient dies. malnutrition. Now, when you look at the constraints landscape, I'm now moving into the organizational landscape. And there's two bounding factors here. One is the business, and the other is money. So I want to comment that last year's winner of this same award, Arnie Lund, wrote an excellent UX management book and has been translated into quite a few languages. So what is the state of the union on UX management? Well, you'd think it would be the best of all possible times. We have this great book that Arnie wrote, and whenever I'm at companies and I attend their employee meetings, the CEOs are always yapping about total customer experience and blah, 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 and you'd think that UX budgets would be overflowing and everybody would be, breathing UCD and customer experience, and we really have this all figured out, right? It should be the best of all possible times. Unfortunately, it's not. I had a 35-year industry career and probably ran two of the best funded UX organizations on the planet at the time. But even looking today in the companies I consult with and my former colleagues, there's a fight for day-to-day credibility and resources that continues to go on. And in fact, being a UX leader in Silicon Valley, at least, doesn't have a very long tenure. There's a lot of turnover and a lot of trouble. Why is this, that management remains so hard? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons. Some of them have to do with the dominance of agile methods and certain trends that it forces, the popularization of non-specialist methods like design thinking and Google Sprints. There are MBA programs in design strategy, so there are people in the boardroom who've never designed a product in their life. In the end, it's really because all of these changes in the workplace are revolutionary. They're not evolutionary. And we have competition for ownership. And in addition, you always have this organizational pendulum where large companies, and even medium-sized ones, swing between centralization until paralysis is achieved, and then they swing the other way towards decentralization until paralysis is achieved, and then they start swinging back again. Right, that's the corporate world in a nutshell. However, the decentralization is facilitated a lot by agile software methods and trying to push everything down to a much more local level of ownership. So I thought, okay, well, Arnie wrote this good book, but I need a new management manifesto. He wrote it quite a while ago. And a manifesto that would deal with stakeholder collaboration, but the main point is to make UX appear with engineering and marketing, right? There's no point about being special or better, and this whole nonsense about design-driven corporations are more profitable. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes a lot of different disciplines to bring a successful product to market. So I wanted to do something that wasn't based on the shape of organizations, and based on my experience in some large corporations, I wanted it to be a methodology that could be weaponized. Because being in the boardroom every week is a blood sport. When you look at how would you approach something like this, I said, well, there's pattern-based methods, and we're all familiar with them, and in the UX field. They obviously come from architecture and Christopher Alexander, but we know this notion of pattern-based approaches. So the purpose of pattern-based approaches is obviously to learn from the history of trial and error, and then be fairly efficient in how you execute. Now, trial and error in design is very informative, but how many of you in the audience are managers or have been managers and had to lead teams? Okay. So in management, I'm sure you will agree with me, trial and error is a suicidal approach, okay? Trial and error, you lose a lot of political capital and friends. So I decided to try to articulate a management framework that was based on design patterns. And in my perfect world, I basically said there would be 4 levels, and I love triangles, so everything I do is like triangles. Buckminster Fuller fanatic, okay? But you'd have a planning level, and the key skill in terms of planning, if you're a manager, we're not talking about strategy, we left that topic 10 minutes ago, is negotiation. Decision making, the key behavioral characteristic of the leader is emotional detachment. Tactics, it's all about multitasking, how many balls can you juggle. And conflicts, and there need to be patterns for dealing with conflict, you need courage. As I noted before, you're bracketed by the business mission at the top and how much money you have at the bottom. And then in the middle, you begin to see that there's things that you have to manage, right? At the planning level, you're managing time and risk. Decision making, it's creativity, your culture, how rewards and punishments are merited. In the middle, you have your stakeholder community, and I go back to actually an article that I didn't mention before about the 360 degrees of UX leadership, which was published in Interactions, probably in the Stone Ages. You have this whole thing that you're managing, and then when you get to the level of conflict, you're basically in the business of removing enemies and maintaining your moral authority when you do so. So this is an interesting high-level framework, but my favorite quote in the world from Yogi Berra is, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice they are not. So how does one make this tangible and into a playbook? And the conclusion that I came to was, well, you have to really clearly define the what and the how. So in the article, you'll find, for each of these levels, a discussion of the different whats and a whole bunch of hows and a lot of discussion. Now, I'm certainly not going to read you these tables, so I want to take a different approach. And I'm going to tell you about one story. I'm going to give you one story for just each line item here in one little section. The story has two actors, myself in the lower left, sitting in front of the Oracle Tower in that John Reinfrank article, and Larry Ellison, one of my more favorite CEOs, probably my second favorite CEO, and I've worked for a dozen of them, so I can rank them. And I want to set the context, because at least in Silicon Valley, Larry gets a really bad rep sometimes. I was employee number one in terms of UX at Oracle. And to give you some context, I was the second person, to my knowledge, to have a VP title of UX in the tech industry, Don Norman being the first at Apple. And it was really just me, or maybe I'd hired one or two people, and I was giving my first presentation in the boardroom, and I was explaining what I thought Oracle needed to do. And I was very nervous. I'd heard all this chatter about how obnoxious and aggressive Larry could be. And I got to my fifth or sixth slide, and Larry, in front of his entire engineering team, all the line of business managers, said, "Stop." And I thought, okay, my career is over. This was the shortest PowerPoint presentation. I'm out of here. And he said, "Dan, start over. Real slow. I get that this is really important. Everything you're telling me is new. It's new to me, and I bet you it's new to everybody else in this room. Go back and make sure we understand what's going on." Year one. So I want to talk about an economic conflict of interest. In my proposal for what needed to be changed, which included, this is so long ago, having a graphical user interface for the Oracle database. At the time I joined, there was a command line interface written by two surfer dudes in Australia called SQL SQL Manager, whatever. And immediately, the head of the support organization basically said, you can't give them a better user interface. We derive, and it was a very big number, hundreds and hundreds of millions, I believe, support revenue doing all that stuff for our customers. You can't let them do it themselves. My profit center, support, is going to go out of business. So fortunately, I did not have to get in a fight with the head of support. Larry kind of looked at him and said, "So Randy, our business, You're claiming that it's a better business model to make a product that people can't use. Do you understand what you're saying? So anyway, the good news, and these all stories kind of have happy endings, was at that time Oracle had a 2,000-person support organization. The company was making about $1 billion a year. Over the next 2 years, the company went to $1 billion a quarter. And because of the work that the UX team did to create the first administrative GUI, the support organization didn't grow. So you can imagine the escalation in customers. And then the support organization actually liked it because there was a way for them to connect remotely through that interface. So it was a reasonable outcome with the correct value for the shareholders and the correct value for the users. Now, decision making. Let me pick one line. Never act on or spread secondhand information, right? One of the things that people make a lot of decisions about and on and lose their jobs over is erroneous information. So the story I want to share with you here was about two competing engineering teams who were both supposedly building the same product in different divisions with no love shared between them. When you're the central UX team in a large company, you're like Rome. All roads lead through Rome. And these two guys were fighting, and we were in the boardroom, and one was claiming, you know, they were ready to ship, and the other, and claiming the other part of the company didn't even have a product. And so when the meeting ended, Larry came over to me and said, and this was my most typical conversation with him, was, Dan, what's going on? Does product B exist or not? And I said, Larry, you want to use it? It's in the usability lab right now. Let's walk over one building. You can sit down and try it. But here, it was not me trying to get involved in this battle between these two different lines of business. The good news is, Larry came down to the usability lab. He tried it. He said, do you happen to have the other division's product? And Anna said, yes. It's in another lab. Go try it. And by the end of the day, those two divisions were merged. And it was no pain to the UX department because the designers had been working together all along, knowing that sooner or later, somebody would figure this out, and there was a common design. Tactics. So I already talked about that one. Tactics. Build a lab and use it to evangelize and educate. To this, I have to give credit to Anna Wachanski, and she managed to get us a 10,000 square foot lab at Oracle on the first try. We never had a little baby lab. We just had a floor of one of those buildings. And we would insist that the line of business managers would have to come and use their products in the usability lab before the products could ship. And we reported the usability lab data at Larry's staff meeting every week. So the artifact of having this physical facility really did matter. When people tell you you don't need this anymore, from a management perspective, it's not true. It's not the same as clickstream metrics. Now, conflict. Conflict is really about personal credibility and moral authority. And here I quote frequently in the article from Don Corleone. Everything you need to know about UX management you can find in the movie The Godfather. My two favorite quotes are revenge is a dish best eaten cold, and keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So the story I want to share with you here, and this is my last story, is the UX organization was hosted in one division of the company, and we quickly took over all the UX work, or started the UX work for the server division, which was the cash cow. The applications division had its own UX team. And I did not want to get involved in picking a fight over ownership of everything. So one day, there's a presentation at Larry's staff meeting, and he says, and somebody from the applications team, I won't mention their name, shows this really horrible idea and design for the next release. And Larry turns to me and he says, Dan, who designed this expletive deleted piece of expletive deleted? And I just looked at him and I said, well, Larry, didn't you know the apps has their own UX team? And he looks at me and he says, really? And then he turns to the general manager of that division of the company and he said, Ron, is that true? And Ron is slowly nodding his head, figuring he's can't get out of this. And then Larry looks at him again and he says, not anymore. They don't. And he stops the meeting and he picks up the phone. He calls the VP of Human Resources and has all of those people transferred to me by the end of the day. Okay? But again, you can't maintain moral authority by being a critic, right? And trying to seed this kind of thing. These things will happen naturally. Now, it has a happy ending because it turned out that the head of the apps team was actually a really good guy, and we got along just fine. And he more or less adopted me, and I would go to his staff meetings every week. And he later became a venture capitalist, and he was the first person to refer business to me. So I do see him and have breakfast with him occasionally. So again, it could have been a dicey situation, but it worked out okay. So these patterns basically kind of form a playbook, and they have a history because there's now over 40 people in the UX world who have VP titles who came out of that 150-person Oracle experience. I will warn you that your mileage will vary. Once if you read the article and look at the details, you need to vary and adjust by your company culture. So the takeaways here are pretty simple. I think this pattern-based approach that we just published does account for corporate behavioral complexity. It's not based on any specific UX team size or where you sit in engineering or marketing or the chief technology officer, but a warning or two. The aggressive patterns, the Don Corleone stuff, very dangerous in the hands of an amateur. Don't do this until you have a lot of credibility, and you will need to build the infrastructure that's described in the article before the crisis. You can't do it late. And so that was just a very condensed look at the business of UX value cycle. And as I said, I hope some of you will offer articles for the forum, and thank you for attending my talk.